Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Volkin, and I'm the co-founder of the Love Your Neighbor project, along with the editor of The Source Weekly. I co-founded this project along with Erika McCalpine, who's the moderator of tonight's panel. It's my pleasure and privilege to kick things off tonight on this important topic, Oregon's historical Black exclusion laws. I'd like to spend a moment introducing you to Erika McCalpine. She's the director of the OSU-Cascades Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Laboratory. She's also a business instructor and leads the business administration program, teaching courses in human resources, business ethics, leadership, and entrepreneurship. In 2019, she received the OSU Francis Dancy Hooks Award for building bridges across cultures and showing courage in promoting diversity. She received the OSU-Cascades Diversity Award in 2019 as well. She's also the president-elect of the Faculty Senate for all campuses of Oregon State. Erika, as I mentioned, is also the co-founder of the Love Your Neighbor project. This grassroots effort encourages community members to appreciate and accept fellow residents from diverse backgrounds. She was also named the Source Weekly Woman of the Year in 2019. It's my pleasure now to introduce Erika.
Thanks, Nicole. And thanks to our panelists and Love Your Neighbor audience for joining us tonight. We are having this conversation tonight in honor of Black History Month. February has been acknowledged as Black History Month in the United States since 1976. This year's theme for Black History Month is Black family, representation, identity, and diversity, and the spread of Black families across the United States. With that theme in mind, tonight's panel will be discussing Oregon's Black exclusion laws and the impacts that those laws have had on the amount of diversity that we see in Oregon today. Here is Nathan Moses to tell you how to submit your questions for tonight's panelists.
All right, Erika, thank you very much, and glad to be a part of this again tonight. Those of you that have joined our virtual events in the past, we are using Mentimeter per usual. So you have instructions at the bottom of your screen to visit menti.com. You're going to input the code 8039621. You can also take a QR code reading of what's on the screen right now via the mobile app. You can ask questions during the panel or at the end of their presentations as they come up to you. So please feel free to submit. More questions, the better. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nathan. And now to introduce our panelists. We have with us Dr. Stacey Smith, an associate professor of history in OSU's College of Liberal Arts, whose research focuses on the history of the North American West, and particularly on race relations, labor, and politics. She is the author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor, Emancipation, and Reconstruction, which won the 2014 David Montgomery Award from the Organization of American Historians. Stacey has written for the New York Times and blackpast.org. We also have Dr. Robert Thompson, an associate professor of ethnic studies in OSU's College of Liberal Arts. Trained as a sociologist, Dr. Thompson specializes in African-American history, including early 20th century political and social thought, racial patterns of urbanization, and popular culture. He is the author of a chapter titled Population, an Atlas of the Pacific Northwest. Then we have Dwayne Plaza, a professor of sociology in OSU's School of Public Policy and a former assistant dean in the College of Liberal Arts. His research and writings have focused on migration and settlement practices of Caribbeans and immigration policy in Canada. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us tonight, and we will open tonight's events with Dr. Stacey Smith.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen quickly here. I really want to thank Erika for organizing this event and for her very kind invitation to participate. I'm actually an expert on California history, but I'm here at Oregon State University, and so I've learned quite a bit more about 19th century Oregon and especially its Black exclusion laws. So I'm going to be sharing some of the basic context and background with you today, just to sort of set the scene for the rest of the commentary that we'll have during the panel. now. So here is sort of an overview and timeline of the main events and changes to these laws as they unfolded across the 1840s and the 1850s. I'll go through those with you quickly. And really kind of the one thing you want to notice is this pattern in which white settlers in Oregon didn't just pass one exclusion law, but they passed multiple exclusion laws at different stages of provisional government, territorial government, and state government development. So the very first of these exclusion laws came from Oregon's Provisional Legislative Council. This is before Oregon even became a territory. The provisional government passed the first Black exclusion law, which stated that, and this is the famous Lash Law, as it's nicknamed, it stated that free Black people in Oregon who were already here or who would come later would have 2 to 3 years, depending on their gender, actually. Women had 3 years, men had 2 years, for reasons we can talk about later, to leave, or they would face a public whipping. And the whipping would continue incrementally every 6 months until the person left, right? So this was the original Lash Law, the most famous one that you're probably familiar with. About 6 months later, and I'm still a little bit unclear about why this happened, and maybe some of our other panelists have some insight into it, the Provisional Council essentially decided, like, this Lash Law, probably because it was getting a lot of bad press and was deemed to be cruel and unusual punishment, they changed the law to eliminate the whipping part of it. Instead, and I don't know that this is really any better, Black residents who didn't leave could be arrested and auctioned off essentially to the highest bidder, who would agree to pay the person's transportation costs out of the state. And essentially what they would do is work for that person who bid on them until they had paid off those transportation costs. So that's the 1844 law. When Oregon became a territory, it enacts yet another different exclusion law. So each level of government, as the state develops, passes one of these laws. It's a very similar law, except that it said that people who were already in the territory, who were of African descent, could stay. Okay, so it sort of grandfathered them in, but it said new arrivals had only 30 days to leave the state or faced arrest and expulsion. And then, oddly enough, 5 years later, I mean, this law was on the books for about 5 years until May of 1854, when the territorial legislature had a whoops moment, I guess, and decided that they were going to overhaul the state's legal code, and fortuitously forgot to include this Black exclusion law from 1849 in the new legal code. So basically it was nullified as a result of a legislative accident. Well, as you might guess, that didn't stand, and it was really when statehood came around that Oregon again made a bid for passing this law, or a version of this law. And it came in the Oregon constitutional approval process. So Oregon put together finally a state constitution. The voters of the state, who were all white men pretty much, voted on that. And as part of the voting on this new constitution, they actually voted separately on 2 different issues. 1, should slavery be allowed in Oregon? And 2, should Black people, free Black people, be allowed in Oregon? And Oregon's white voters said no on both of these propositions. They didn't want slavery. They didn't want free Black people to be able to live in the state. So we're going to jump ahead, and some interesting things happen, right? After the Civil War, things start to change. Oregon ratified the 14th Amendment, which declared that African Americans were citizens of the United States and that they had or should enjoy the equal protection of the law. Okay? And that has ramifications for our story because essentially the 14th Amendment, when it was finally ratified in 1868, essentially nullified any Black exclusion laws in Oregon, right? It's now unconstitutional, against the US Constitution, and essentially unenforceable. That doesn't mean that the exclusion clause went away. And in fact, it actually stayed on the books. One interesting thing that we should note is that Oregon actually decided, after ratifying the 14th Amendment early on in 1866, to rescind ratification. It's a very rare thing that ever happens, but the state of Oregon said, like, actually, we're going to back off the 14th Amendment. We don't like this legislation, and it's mainly because white Oregonians opposed Chinese immigrants becoming citizens, which might have happened under the 14th Amendment, or they were worried that it would. Now, that doesn't mean that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply in Oregon. Even if the state didn't ratify it, it's still US law. It's still part of the US Constitution. But it just shows you the tension there, right? Oregon says, like, oh, I guess we have to abide by the 14th Amendment, but we're going to retract our approval. And perhaps partly related to that, the Black Exclusion Clause of the state constitution stayed in the state constitution until 1926. And it was really the lobbying of the state's Black residents, specifically the NAACP and Black women who were members of the League of Women Voters, who got it on a ballot initiative, and Oregonians finally voted to get rid of this clause of the Constitution in 1926. So it's completely unenforceable, it's unconstitutional, but it remains in the state constitution until 1926. Okay, so that's the broad overview. I just want to sort of talk about, well, what does all of this mean, and why did it pass? What were the consequences? So, rationales for exclusion. You've probably heard a variety of different rationales, but I'm going to share with you, in the words of the time, what some white Oregonians had to say about why they wanted to pass these laws. Jesse Applegate, who is an early white settler of Oregon, was actually anti-slavery, but he was originally from Maine, but he was from a border slave state, the state of Missouri, where there were lots of poor white farmers and not quite as many slaves as in the rest of the South. And so what Applegate essentially explained here is that I was a poor white person from a slave state, and I can say that what's going on in Oregon is that a lot of these people here in Oregon are other poor whites from slave states. And these people hate slavery because of the economic competition that it poses for poor white farmers. And so, so poor whites in Oregon, especially those from slave states, don't want slavery, but they also fear competition from free Black people as well. Right, so this general sense that the West needs to be preserved as a haven for poor white people, so that they can have land and escape the system of slavery and Black people in general. A couple of other quotations. I'm not going to read these out to you. Hopefully you'll have the ability to read them on your own screen. But a couple of other justifications that white settlers in Oregon came up with might be sort of surprising. As you'll see here in the preamble, it's basically the explanation to the 1849 bill in the yellow box here, and then the big gray box in the middle. There were whites in Oregon politics who essentially argued that Black exclusion was necessary because they were worried about the state's Native American population. And specifically, they were worried that African Americans would team up with, intermix socially and sexually with Native Americans. And the two groups would essentially engage in a race war against the white settlers of the state. So this is a time when wars against Native people are really heating up. And there was an incident in 1844 in which a free Black man in Oregon was implicated in this moment of Native American resistance against white settlers. And so there was this sort of a panic that African Americans and Native Americans are going to essentially kind of team up and engage in a race war against white people, which is a really weird Oregon thing. I've never seen this happen in, well, of course it happens in Florida and other places in the East, but not so much here out West, right? We don't see that rationale that much in other places. And then I'll just quickly point out that the Oregonian, a newspaper that may still sound familiar to you, even as late as 1865, right before the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, is already saying that, well, is continuing to say, I should say, that Black people should not be citizens. Right? That they have no ability to govern themselves. They are not intelligent enough to participate in civic affairs and political affairs. And that Oregon and the other states need to be very careful before allowing people of African or Chinese, that's what they mean by Mongolian at the bottom of this quotation here, or Native American people of that descent to have citizenship and be involved in the basic governance of the state. Just letting you read these for a second, and I can go back to these later on in the Q&A if folks are interested. What I want to point out is that even though we really focus on the exclusion laws, especially the Lash law, that very first one I talked about, it's really important, I think, to understand, and I think some of my other panelists, fellow panelists are going to talk about this, understand that exclusion is only one plank in a broad legislative platform of anti-Black legislation in Oregon. Okay, so this is just one of many different anti-Black laws passed in about the same period. So the Oregon Donation Land Act, which is one of the acts that gives land, Native people's land, away to American settlers, was restricted to adult white men and, quote, American half-breed Indians. Okay, so people who had some Native ancestry, and only those people who were US citizens of white or half Native American ancestry could claim land under this Donation Land Act. So this huge amount of land is distributed in a racialized way and is only really available for white people. In 1854, Oregon passed essentially, the Oregon Territory passed a law that prohibited most people of color from being able to give testimony in court cases involving white people. And so you can imagine that all kinds of abuses against the lives and property of Black people happen under this law because they cannot give testimony against white people who abuse them. In 1857, the Oregon Constitution prohibited Black and Chinese people from voting. It says that outright. In 1862, the state legislature, and this is in the middle of the Civil War, levies a $5 head tax, a poll tax, on Black, Chinese, and Hawaiian residents. And those who can't pay that annual $5 tax have to work it off by essentially working on the public roads for some time each year. And of course, anti-miscegenation laws. In 1866, Oregon prohibited marriage between white people and people of Black, Chinese, Hawaiian, or Native American ancestry. And actually, Oregon's miscegenation laws would not be stricken from the record until the 20th century, until the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century. Okay, so just trying to put all of these in perspective. So something I sometimes hear is, well, there's this sort of defensiveness about Oregon. Well, Oregon is no more racist than any other state in this era. All of the states are racist and have these laws. Well, yes and no, right? This is a table that just sort of shows us where Oregon falls, essentially. And this is the list of states, list of free states by entrance into the Union, I think is the idea. No, that can't be right. Anyway, but Oregon's not at the bottom because it's like the bad one. It's because it was the state most recently to enter the United States. So you see that Oregon actually, you know, it does have something in common with some other states, in that this Black exclusion law was actually a law in some of the Midwestern states, in Illinois and Indiana, where, not coincidentally, a fair number of the early white settlers of Oregon were from. Oregon also followed suit with those other states in having a ban on people of African descent testifying in the courts. And like virtually all states, free states in this period, African Americans could not vote in Oregon. But so I want to say, yeah, you know, I want to show you that, well, in some ways, Oregon isn't an outlier, because certainly we have these Midwestern states that have very strict Black codes. But if you look at Oregon compared to, you know, even other states that have a lot of anti-Black racism in them, you see that Oregon's are particularly harsh. Even, you know, California, which was no friend to African Americans in the 1850s, had more protections and some more civil rights for African Americans than Oregon did. So the record is pretty mixed on that. Enforcement and resistance, and this is probably kind of the last bit I will do here. We only know of one man who was actually forcibly expelled out of Oregon due to these laws. He was a man named James Vanderpool, who was a Black West Indian, that is, he was from the Caribbean, sailor, and he had basically come off of a ship into Oregon, set up a boarding house in the Salem area, and he was expelled under the 1849 exclusion law in 1851. We don't know much about him beyond that, and this very bad, hard to read newspaper article is some of the only evidence that we have about it in Oregon media at the time. But I also wanted to point out something that I think is really important for us to remember, which is that even back in this period, there were some people who wanted to build an interracial anti-racist coalition. Right? This is the heartening part. This is the uplifting part to me. There were a couple of petitions that came before the Oregon legislature in the 1850s. And these were white Oregonians writing petitions to the state legislature or the territorial legislature in what, or I guess they're both territorial legislature, saying, look, we know there's this law in the books, but we have a Black family who lives next door, and we want them to be exempt from these laws. And so you see that the excerpt here that I have is 128 white Oregonians signed this petition saying, let our neighbor Morris Thomas and his family stay in Oregon. And this is from 1854. And there's another successful petition, very similar one, in 1851. That was successful. Interestingly, the Morris Thomas one, this is kind of when they went into the books and figured out that the law had been accidentally repealed earlier in the year. And so this petition actually didn't go anywhere because they realized, oh, there isn't an exclusion law anymore. It was interesting in and of itself. So quickly, I just want to say a couple words about, and I think our other panelists are going to do this a lot better than I will, some of the legacies of Oregon's anti-Black legislation. Obviously, if we think about the Oregon Donation Land Act, there were immense barriers to economic opportunity and wealth building across generations. Just lack of access to land, the basic thing that generated wealth in Oregon territory. Barriers to chain migration. If people can't come to the state in the first place, then they can't encourage their kinfolk to come west either, right? And so there's less of this process of bringing your family west in Oregon than we find in a place like California, where I study. One outcome potentially that some scholars have talked about is that white Oregonians' lack of contact with Black people allows this kind of anti-Black racism and white supremacy to fester. It's a lot easier for white people in Oregon to see Black people as alien and other when they don't actually encounter them on a daily basis because of these exclusion laws. There's no version of, at least I don't think so, of the Oregon dream for Black people. In California, there was a version of that, right? African Americans could go and become wealthy in the gold rush. The Oregon dream was almost always racialized as white because of these exclusion laws. And then the very last bit, and I promise because I'm going over, sorry, Erika, just last point is that just thinking about this, and you really, if you have to build a big political coalition to make change in the law, to make reforms, to change the political climate, that's really difficult when you have a small population of Black Oregonians. Right? You really are going to have to rely on white allies sometimes to make this happen. And so I think that it actually is very difficult, at least in some of the periods of Oregon history, difficult for this legislation to actually go into effect because of this and to repeal these racist laws. And just as an example of this, Oregon didn't actually go and ratify the 14th Amendment, go back and re-ratify it until 1973 as a result of really concerted activism by the NAACP and other Black civil rights groups. So I'm going to end there. I went a little bit over. Again, I'm sorry, Erika, and I will turn it over to my next panelist. I hope that at least kind of gave us an overview of some of the issues we might talk about tonight.
Thank you so much, Stacey. We will have Dr. Thompson start now.
Forgot. Okay, thank you, Erika and Stacey. Thank you much. First, I want to thank Erika McCalpine and Nicole Vulcan for hosting this panel and inviting me to it to discuss this very important topic. I open my brief comments by framing them, if you will, one as competing ideas of expectation and exclusion, and the other as inclusion and welcome. For the framing of the first idea, I'll quote a passage from Herman Melville, his book, or his from A White Jacket, 1850, quoting, "And we Americans are the peculiar, chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. Long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves and doubted whether indeed the political Messiah had come, but he has come in us. And if we would but give utterance to his promptings," Herman Melville. For my second framing idea, I will read a few lines from my play, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, The Conversation, and Abolition Tale. Harriet Jacobs is speaking, just to frame it for you, recalling when she discovered at the age of 6 that she was enslaved, a piece of merchandise, as she put it. Her mistress had died, and who taught her Bible principles and precepts of love and neighborliness. And I read, quote, "Now when my mistress died and her will was read, I learned that she, my mistress, had bequeathed me to her sister's daughter, a child of only 5 years old. My mistress had taught me the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Whatsoever ye do that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. But I was her slave, and I suppose she did not recognize me as her neighbor. In the third framing idea, I want to draw from Dr. Martin Luther King's portion of his speech, The Drum Major Instinct. King recounts the Bible parable about the man walking on the Jericho road to Damascus, who is set upon by robbers, beaten, robbed, left for dead alongside the road. As King tells the story, a rabbi comes by and sees the man lying there in need of help and asked, if I stop to help this man, what will my congregants think of me if I stop to help him? Another man passes by and sees the man still lying by the side of the road in need. This man was prominent in the region, wealthy man. And he thought to himself that if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? The robbers might still be waiting in the shadows for another victim. A third man came by, walking on the same dangerous road. He was a Samaritan, and if you will remember, of a minoritized group of the day. He looked and saw the man lying there, bleeding, and asked the question by reversing it and said, if I do not stop to help this man, and he didn't ask what will happen to himself, but rather, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? I want to add at this point here that the competing ideas mentioned above, inclusion, exclusion, expectation, I suggest expresses the limitations and expresses limitations and exclusivity. And on the other hand, I'd like to, is the expression of openness and possibilities. These competing ideas, as you all know, are embedded in the origins of the founding of North America and the establishment of Oregon, the state of Oregon. So the title of this panel discusses the competing ideas mentioned above are in play here to love your neighbor. What is love your neighbor? I'm thinking about my contribution to the panel discussion, the Black exclusion laws. I'm not so much stating or restating the various exclusion laws, the Black exclusion laws in Oregon established, but what I am interested in is the continental and global movement that would create exclusionary laws, not only in Oregon, the United States, but various places around the world, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil, etc. Catherine Barber, in her 2019 article, we were at our journey's end, settlers, sovereignty, formation in Oregon, states, and coming at it a little differently, the story of the settlers and the arduous journey. For too long, Oregon history has been captive in the mid-19th century's rambling wagon trains, settler stories of motivations, hardships, and achievements preserved in diaries, letters, and memoirs are compelling and deserving of the attention lavished on them. But more is necessary. Oregon's Euro-Americans were intimately tied to national, international events that saw the rise of white European colonial expansion into the colored world. Alongside that expansion was the development of a framework of domination justified by claims of superiority and destiny that conflated the ability to control with the rights to do so. Placing Oregon history in this larger geopolitical context allows a more coherent understanding of what made Oregon what it became and what that history has to do with Oregon today. The point is, the history that we are discussing is a history of the rise of white supremacy. Here's the definition, if you will, of white supremacy. And I'm going to use Francis Lee Ansley's definition. White supremacy is defined as a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Now, in this usage of the term white supremacy does not denote individualized racist actions, but rather identifies, if you will, the presumed superiority of white racial identities, however problematically defined in support of cultural, political, and economic domination of non-white groups. Now, the economics noted in that definition of Catron, noted in the definition above, is capitalism. We talked about it, and I want to be very direct about that. In terms of capitalism, we're talking about drawing on Cedric Robinson's notion of racial capitalism. And speaking here, we're talking about what we've seen is when speaking of racial capitalism, we understand that capitalism is a relationship. For capitalism to survive, it must exploit and prey upon unequal differential of human value. And that is white over black, white over red, white over Kanaka, white over brown, white over Asian in that sense. Here, I want to define white in that sense, because along underneath this is we're looking at, well, what is white? And if we're doing that, then what is race? And that's a good question here. So I'm going to use this in the terms of expectation and exclusion. And in the beginning of the North American colony, whiteness was created by white people of privilege and advantage, as Thompson would argue. Whiteness is an expectation, sometimes an unconscious expectation that the government will maintain laws and policies generally benefiting white people. The system, as Carmen Thompson, not related, no relation, continues, which has been put into force through all institutions that govern American society, is white supremacy. That is the hierarchical ordering of human beings based on phenotype. That is what Du Bois says of hair, skin, and bone, the physical attributes we call race. Now, for instance, looking at this and acting on that, I refer you to the Catholic doctrine of discovery, which has exclusion and expectations in it, the Monroe Doctrine that would come later, 1823, the Tyler Doctrine that would claim the islands in the Pacific. And earlier than that really is John Locke's fundamental constitution for Carolina in 1663, 1669, where he argues that, Locke suggests that the people should have, every white man should own a Negro, male or female. And part of that, I suggest to you, is Locke's offering to the competing religious and contentious religious uproar on the European continent, where they've been after each other's throats, Catholics and Protestants and whatnot, as a way of rapprochement or entente to settle, not so much on religious differences, but on this new racial possibility that we have as a pan-European white group against the Black here. This will solidify us. John C. Calhoun, later in the early 1800s, would write about the need for every propertyless white man and setting up banking systems and credit systems for the average everyday white man to own a Negro male or female there. And that's part of what my play is about, looking at that process of owning and buying folk. So, but expectation, so we have exclusion. Expectation is only one side of the equation in making whiteness, thus white supremacy. The process of making, that is the fabrication, if you will, or as James Baldwin would call, the lie of whiteness. The European establishment of early North American colonies was a process that included conquest, genocide, land theft of indigenous peoples of the continent, enslavement of Africans, and forced cultural change. And these actions are what created the ideology that identified white America. And the point that I make is that in exclusion, expectation, what is expected, what's known through the doctrine of discovery and the other laws that are here, that this is white man's land in terms of removing the indigenous people off the land and removing the wealth of the labor from the Africans, the laboring African, their enslaved Africans, out of the soil that's here on Turtle Island, as America, as the indigenous call this Turtle Island, before the United States, emerges this white American identity here. So then American whiteness is inextricably linked to the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, to the colonization of Indian lands in North America. So then exclusion is this process, as Lewis argues, in which freedom of white people is based upon and bound to the unfreedom of indigenous people in their lands and culture, and the unfreedom of Africans to their bodies and their culture and their labor. And that's in for instance, in 1612, Virginia officials were concerned about the European settlers marrying Native women, but did not employ the term white at this particular time. White is, and I'm getting at, whiteness is not something that is a definition. Whiteness is something that has to be made. It's constructed. Instead, referred to those women as savages and to the men as English men. Similarly, in the 23 West African people listed in Virginia's 1624 census had the word Negro before and after their names, while a list of 16 European servants documented on the same census were recorded simply as using their full names without any racial designation there. So directly speaking, if you will, racial positions exist, if you will, only by definition. They are not inherent in people. As Steve Minot argues, white people are not born white. They are made white by white supremacist society. Likewise, Black people are not born Black, but are made Black by white supremacist society. The fabrication of Black people, which constitutes the kind of knowledge, that is the notions of Black people in the minds of white people, is the core of anti-Black racism. Let's see. Racism between, so anyway, let's go on. So constructed, like I lost my slide, constructed by white people. So racism is in relation between white people and of which Black people are the means, if you will, to whiteness. And I want to kind of go here because Toni Morrison brings this up very well in her book, the late Toni Morrison in her book, Playing in the Dark, and go back through that whiteness, Black people are the means through which white people become white, but it doesn't stop there, actually. So Toni Morrison in her wonderful book, Playing in the Dark, addresses the fabrication of the Africanist persona that is employed by white writers in the construction of whiteness, of their character, of their characters, and as Morrison would say, of themselves, in turn of themselves. At this point, I want to mention a few legislative laws and acts that were intended to exclude Africans and Black people from North America, and including Oregon. So some will overlap with my fellow panelists before me, Stacey, and some will not. So anyway, John Hope Franklin, the historian, Black historian, talks about this book from the Naturalization Law of 1790 from slavery to freedom. And he says, one of the questions to be settled was who was worthy of citizenship in this new nation, which aspired to become a model for all future democracies. The question was answered without much debate. Only white aliens, the law of 1790 specified, could become naturalized citizens of the United States. Any free Black person imprudent enough to migrate to the United States could not hope ever of becoming a citizen. 53 years later, the naturalization of the 1790 naturalization, Oregon's small white population had voted on 5 July 1843 to prohibit slavery by incorporating into Oregon's 1843 organic laws the provision of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in said territory otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And I take a note and aside to this, is that's really interesting what this law or this provision sort of portended, because this, as I put in my note here, points to the 13th Amendment, the law, the amendment, the Civil War amendment that would end slavery, supposedly, but a clause with a subclause or a hook on it that says, except, line for line, except when one is duly convicted of a crime. But I also want to add that amendment, the 13th Amendment, was the second one, because the First Amendment was stopped when Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter in 1860, when Ohio, it was ratifying the 13th Amendment that there could be no amendment to overturn slavery in the United States, and that was stopped in 1690 on the firing on Fort Sumter. Ohio was ready to vote, and they would have been the last one. Anyway, in a year later, in June 18, 1844, a provisional government passes Oregon's first Black exclusion law. It states that Blacks who tried to settle in Oregon would be publicly whipped. As Stacey said, this was the Lash Law, this whole punishment thing. Here, just a note above that this anti-slavery part was not something that white people here liked Black people and didn't want to see them. They didn't want to, it reminds, as a matter of fact, when Stacey was talking, I wrote Free Soil, Free Men, Free Labor in the run-up to the Civil War. Kansas, bleeding Kansas, white men couldn't compete with enslaved labor. As those who owned the slaves, owned the enslaved people, were pushing them. It's sort of like the NAFTA, before NAFTA of 1994. The labor was going to the cheapest or free labor, unpaid labor, and they couldn't compete with that. So thus, bleeding Kansas and the beginning of the Civil War there in 1854. So anyway, in 1844, the earlier exclusion law was changed, and Blacks who tried to settle in Oregon would not be whipped. Instead, they would just be forced to do public labor there, which sort of harkens to me to some of the and prison laws that they've had in Oregon in 1994 and the other ones here that speak to that were overturned by the Supreme Court, Oregon Supreme Court, after they were implemented. A provisional government legislative committee repealed actions relating to slavery in July 45. This is where I want to end this part and then pop over to just another little 4 minutes. 67 years later, 1857, Dred Scott and the Dred Scott case, the US Supreme Court decision declared that the framers of the Constitution, and this is Chief Justice Taney, who gave the opinion of this, Chief Justice Taney, the framers of the Constitution did not intend Black people to be citizens of the United States, and as such, they did not have any rights that a white man need respect. Now, in this, with a few later developments, and I just want to point out, I think one of the things, just reading this a little bit and trying to figure out where I was going to fit on this and go with this, I was impressed with African-American or Black people's fight against these injustices, to move it. And as a matter of fact, as I'm looking at it, I'm be more direct about it. I think in terms of looking at whiteness as something that's limited and has an exclusionary and not expansive. But in Blackness, you will see, I argue, you can see it in jazz and other places, that Blackness is the welcome, is open, is inclusive, and has been inclusive of all. And so one of the things I want to just mention here, and I want to bring up Beatrice Kennedy, who in 1922 was the first African-American woman to graduate from Lewis Clark Law School. She would be one of the presidents and major mover in the NAACP there here in Oregon. 1921, Oregon becomes a Klan state from top to bottom in that respect there. You have the 1926, the exclusionary clause is removed from Oregon Constitution. 1954, 1951, I should say, law repeal prohibiting interracial marriage. And some of the things early on in the 19th century, there was as Peggy Pascal talks about, no miscegenation between Kanaka Hawaiians and Blacks and Indians and this and that. I like the point that she made about the fear that Indians and Indigenous and Blacks would get together, because they were in various places, and not just in the South, East. They were in Florida, the Carolinas and places like that, but even in Texas and down further. But anyway, you have 1953, the Public Accommodations Law. So that's overturned. In 1953, the Public Accommodations Laws prohibits racial discrimination in business. And I was impressed, 1957, Oregon had actually passed a fair housing law. That didn't happen in California until after, I believe, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. And now we'll move to Dr. Dwayne Plaza.
All right, thank you, Erika. And let me just begin my slideshow here. All right, so as I begin my slideshow, I want to just thank you both, Professor Smith and Thompson, for setting me up here in a sense. I would like to take you now on a journey that looks at public policy and practices that really help to keep Oregon white. And what I'd like to do with you all tonight is to make you a little uncomfortable. These are some of the things that you may not know about that are part of Oregon's DNA and part of Oregon's history. And I also want you to realize too that people of color actually know this history. Many people of color know this history. And we pass it on as a way of us coping with circumstances that are oftentimes overwhelming to us in terms of the microaggressions or the feelings of exclusion that have existed in Oregon from its early beginnings. As I move forward then, I'm going to encourage you, as you listen to what I'm talking about and present you different material, please pull out your smartphone and please pull out whatever device you want and look up the things that I'm gonna be talking about, because I think I can only talk about this much of the history, and you can certainly look up more of it as we go along. So let me begin then, and let's just begin by couching my presentation in things that Dr. Smith and Dr. Thompson have talked about. And I would like to talk about the social construction of race. So race is actually a social construction, but in the United States and in Oregon in particular, race today affects life chances, where you live, how you're treated, your access to wealth, power, and prestige, your access to education, housing, healthcare, and other valued resources. And of course, most importantly, we have enough research to know now that race also affects your life expectancy in Oregon and in other states around the United States. So with that in mind, I'm going to bridge off of what Professor Thompson talked about, this whole notion of anti-Blackness and white supremacy in the United States. So many of us have an understanding of anti-Blackness, and or white supremacy, but we oftentimes only think about it in the context of this iceberg, which motif that I've got going on in front of you here. And if you take a really close look at this motif, most of us think about racism and anti-Blackness only in the context of the upper part of this iceberg that's being shown. That is hate crimes, the KKK, lynching, slavery, or neo-Nazis. That, for many of us, is our definition of when we see an anti-Black sentiment. Let's look below the surface, though, and let's realize that what we're going to talk about tonight with me is a lot of the things that have actually kept Oregon very white. That includes things like housing discrimination. It includes things like insults that Black folks have received on a continual basis while trying to establish themselves in the state of Oregon. It will include looking at policy. That includes policies that have kept Oregon fairly white, not only the ones that we've talked about so far, but other ones that have been in place where the police are actually involved and in policing Oregon as a state. So let's continue. And let me talk about the very first act that I'm going to identify here as one of the ways through which Oregon became very white. And that is the Homestead Act. And again, here's something, if you want to have a chance to look it up, go ahead and Google it, and you will find out much more than I'll talk about right now. But ultimately, the Homestead Act, I refer to it as the very first transfer of wealth from the United States government to white American folks. It's very much a form of affirmative action. Because if you were white, you could arrive in this new territory called Oregon, and you could then go to the land tenure office, and you could apply for a plot of land. And typically, a homesteaded piece of property was about 160 acres. And you would have to show after 5 years that you've put that land in production, and the land tenure office would come out and inspect your property after you have worked it for 5 years. And it was hard work. Let me assure you, it was hard work to clear the land. It was hard work to establish yourself and your family. But what it meant then is that if you could show evidence that you've actually put it under production, you could then get title to that land. And you can imagine this becomes a form of wealth that you can then pass on to your children, and they could pass it on to their children. And it accumulates wealth. All of us know how land works. Okay, in contrast to this, African-American people could not apply for homesteaded properties. This was the purview of one race, and it also wasn't available to Asians, and it also wasn't available to Latinos. So we need to sort of recognize that as one of the ways through which Oregon became white. You encourage lots of people to come out, and you give away assets to some groups, but you don't give them away to others. As was mentioned before by my colleagues, Oregon also had an exclusionary act in its constitution. And Article 1, Section 35 states specifically that no free Negro or mulatto not residing in the state at the time of adoption of this constitution shall come to reside or be within the state or hold any real estate or make any contracts or maintain any suit therein, and the legislative assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers are police officers, of all such Negroes, mulattoes, and for their effective exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state or employ or harbor them. So as Professor Smith has said, and as Professor Thompson have said, this is part of the DNA of Oregon, right here in this constitutional act. And essentially, that gets seeped into the consciousness of our elected officials, white folks who are in the state, and this becomes part of their understanding of their state. It is a white state. In addition to that, many of the various towns in Oregon also passed individual legislation that essentially made them into what we refer to as sundown towns. So once again, here's an opportunity for you to go and look up a little more information on this concept of sundown towns. So if you haven't already done so, please Google that. And you'll realize that there was about 24 towns that were confirmed as sundown towns. And this is often based on the research of James Loewen, a very famous historian. And in Oregon then, what that meant is that list of cities there. And you may see a city there that you actually are living in now, maybe, or a city that you've actually visited or driven through. But in the 1920s, what it meant is that signs we put up that basically told anybody, particularly Black folks, if you were found in this town as the sun goes down, you better not be on the streets. Because if you're on the streets, you are subject to being arrested and thrown in jail by the police, and subject to anything else that happens to you while you're in the jail. I also want you to remember too, at this time, you also have a very close alliance that's taking place between the police and the KKK. And I'll talk about that group in a short little while in terms of understanding how those two were together. And I draw your attention to the events that took place in January 6th, 2021, right here in our capital of the United States, where it's then starting to being revealed as we unfold the case today, that members of that insurrection were police officers themselves, or ex-police officers, or ex-military people. So again, I want to sort of draw your attention to understand this is one of the reasons why it's really difficult for people of color to trust authority figures like the police, to know that they actually have our interest in mind when they are policing or out there as the military, because there's very close linkages that have occurred historically between those groups. They oftentimes were one and the same. If you work for the police, you likely had a connection to the Klan. If you were the sheriff, you likely got elected because you were connected to the Klan in some kind of way. That was going on in the South. It was also going on here in Oregon also. So keep that in mind. And what kind of culture that creates for Black folks. So here in the state of Oregon, I want you to take a look at these pictures very carefully. And I always like to show this one to my students because they oftentimes don't believe. In 1923, there was a Klan rally right in our town called Corvallis. They had rallies in Salem. They had rallies in Eugene, Oregon, right? The most liberal place in the world, Eugene, quote unquote. And here you have situations where you had large gatherings of these men wearing their white robes, marching up and down the streets, essentially occupying space and giving a message to people of color, particularly Black folks, that you better either find your way out of here, but you better not necessarily be here because we could come and terrorize you at any time we want to. So I want you to put yourself in the mindset of a Black person or a person of color, even thinking about being in spaces where these individuals are not hiding, they're actually out in plain sight. And they're actually doing things like having parades, like having ceremonies, like occupying fairgrounds, essentially being normalized in the society in which they are very much entrenched in. So again, think about that as a way in which this becomes a message that's given to African American people. And if that wasn't enough, think about the ways in which lynching was going on, not only in the South, but even in good old Oregon. So the last documented lynching that took place in the state of Oregon took place in Coos Bay. The victim's name was Alonzo Tucker, and he is documented in the Lynching Museum in Alabama as being an individual who was lynched in the state of Oregon. So please, people, when they tell me, oh no, lynching never took place here in Oregon, it did take place. And so I show you some very macabre images here, and I put these images up intentionally because I want you to imagine what's going on in the mindset of African men when they know this might be a fate that they could they could actually experience. And I say it's a fate they could experience because there was always this threat that if you show disrespect, if you got out of line, if you were accused of something you may have not even done, there is a possibility that grave violence could have come to you living in certain parts of the United States. And I want to just point out to you, Oregon also. There's a very heinous image up there of George Floyd having his neck being sat upon by that heinous police officer. That's today in 2020. These other images are from the 1920s. And if you want to go ahead and Google something, go ahead and Google when the last time a lynching took place in the United States. You may be very surprised that lynchings continued into the present. When I say the present, not so long ago. So in the state of Oregon, then, we actually did have public segregation. Oftentimes people say, oh no, Oregon was not a segregated location. Well, I will challenge you with that to realize that Oregon certainly had segregation in its public swimming pools, and it certainly had segregation at skating rinks. It certainly had segregation in its hotels, on the trains, in the cemeteries, in restaurants. Again, this was a very Jim Crow-like South segregation that was going on in Portland. And again, people don't like to ever necessarily put their head around that and actually, again, want to imagine that was a history of Portland. There's a very famous restaurant. I actually usually show my students this menu that comes directly from that restaurant. This restaurant finally closed in 1949. The name of the restaurant was Poon Chicken Inn. That is the name of the place. You can, again, go ahead and Google that and realize once again, these were spaces that were definitely in existence in the state of Oregon, operating in Portland. And these became, again, those spaces that you, as a Black person, knew that you could never necessarily go to that restaurant. And you knew that there was white spaces and Black spaces in the state of Oregon that you would tend to avoid for fear of violence coming to you. We also know, too, that Portland itself was a highly segregated city. And we don't have to go very much further than to look at the redlining policies that were going on with the various real estate agents and the banks working in cahoots to make sure that Oregonians who were Black only were ever shown certain parts of the city in which they could live in, which would be the Northeast. At one point, they were down in Vanport, and but mainly in this Northeast section of Portland. And I want you to understand how this process actually works. So imagine you're a Black family, you decide to get on a train and you decide to get off in Portland. Well, if you do decide to try and find your own place to buy, you're not shown anywhere else in Portland to go and live. You're not shown Lake Oswego. You're not shown, other parts of Gresham, for instance. You're shown only one area that you can actually live in. And so I want you to think about how that actually works when you are only, encouraged and or shown and or given a loan for. The banks would participate in this. So a banker would not give you a loan to buy a house anywhere else. So you essentially found yourself in a sort of ghettoized part of Portland. And so we certainly have lots of evidence of this, whereby for 100 years, real estate agents certainly colluded in certain parts of Portland where they were only showing Negroes and Orientals to the Albina district, right? That's an inner northeast part of Portland. Many of you may have been there, but you often probably wonder, hey, why are all the Black folks and Asian folks and so forth here at one point? Well, they were there because redlining policies meant that they would only be able to live in those areas. I also want you to be aware of something called housing covenants. And these were very important deeds to sort of understand. So if any of you have ever bought a house, you may realize that when you buy the house, you actually have a lawyer come and actually have you sign off on the paperwork. Well, if you actually looked into the paperwork, if you're buying an older house, some of these covenants are actually there, and they still are there, but oftentimes real estate agents will actually take a black marker and black them out because they are still in the deed when the property was actually created. And what these covenants said is that you as the owner are not able to resell that house or that property to anybody but a Aryan person. And if you did that, you would be potentially subjected to be sued by the city for breaking the covenants. And so here's some examples of what the housing covenants look like in both Oregon and Washington state. They would say something like this: no person or persons of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood lineage or extract shall be permitted to occupy a portion of said property or any building thereupon, except as a domestic servant, or may actually in good faith be employed by white occupants of such premises. So these other two covenants say virtually the same thing, but I just want you to be aware that it wasn't easy for people to go and live anywhere they wanted to in Portland. There's a good story I like to also use for my students, and the story goes like this. Lake Oswego, an area you probably all know, was once referred to as Lake No Negro, primarily because nobody would sell African Americans a property in that area of Portland. It's only when the Portland Trailblazers players show up with these very high salaries that they're the very first group that actually get to go and live in Lake Oswego, that area. So even today, Lake Oswego still is a place where you're hard pressed to find much diversity. We also know too, in the 1960s, that Portland also had very segregated schooling districts. So you had Jefferson High School, you had Lincoln High School, for example, in Portland, and they were primarily and predominantly African-American schools. And why was that? Well, they were in areas of Northeast Portland, and those became the catch-all areas for African-Americans. And so we certainly see situations where African-American people start to advocate for their children to get decent access to good schools or more funding for the schools that their children are at. In addition to that, we also know too that even hospitals in Oregon were also segregated. So again, I want you to put yourself in the mindset of somebody even thinking about living in a place where all these institutions are actually not friendly to you. So again, when you hear about this, you have to be a real pioneer. You have to have a real pioneering spirit to want to get onto a train or take a car and drive to this place and want to go and live there, because you already know that certain aspects of your life will be very segregated and opportunities will be very limited for you. So I talked about Albina. So here's a map of Albina. And if you look in the 1940s and 50s in the green section here, you'll see that's the area in which African Americans typically occupied. But again, I want to come back to the whole notion of redlining, which kept them there. Urban renewal projects of the 1960s also affected that population of African Americans who were living there by the 1960s. You may know of this, but the Memorial Coliseum was constructed in 1960. That displaced a whole bunch of African American folks. The construction of the I-5 that went directly through Northeast Portland also affected African Americans. And the construction of the Emanuel Hospital, which is again a hospital that exists even today. If you go there and you actually look at it, you say, wow, what a great campus they have here. But then you start to realize there was actually African American people living all around it at one point, and they were displaced by the construction of that structure. So the African American presence then in Northeast Portland has certainly been one that has been dramatically affected by policy. It's been dramatically affected by opportunities to find work in that area. If you go to the 1970s and 80s, it was considered as an area nobody wanted to go to. It was considered as the ghetto, quote unquote. It was considered as low income. You had lots of situations where the police wouldn't even go into that area because of their manufactured notion of a gang warfare that was going on in that area. And sure, there was violence, but I want you to sort of understand that's a whole other lecture in understanding how those areas became so low income and desolate in a sense. And so I want to end my presentation today by just saying that whole Northeast area has now become gentrified. So gentrification, we need to understand that's another whole lecture within itself, but to understand how gentrification takes place from a space going from a black space back into becoming a white space is a whole process of unfolding of which African Americans have certainly been once again displaced, and banks, police, developers are colluding with each other to again push Black folks out of those areas. And so finally, I'm going to leave you with this notion of trauma. This notion of transgenerational trauma is experienced by African Americans, and that's the trauma of having to gone through all of this exclusion and a constant being under the microscope of authority figures. And this trauma has resulted in generation after generation of African American people living in the Northwest feeling that they have and they rightfully should feel this way, that they are constantly being under the oppressive foot of the dominant group. And so this trauma then gets transferred from parents to children and to other generations, where, of course, people have to learn to cope in those situations. And so I'm not asking anybody to say Black folks are asking for a pass. No, they're not. They just want an acknowledgement of the kinds of policies, the kinds of experiences they've had to deal with, and they still come out, again, positive towards their situation in terms of always looking on the bright side of things. They're not a culture that looks at this as being something that they can't surmount, and African-American people are constantly moving forward. So on that note, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to say thank you very much for allowing me to have time, Erika and others.
Thank you so much, Dwayne and Dr. Thompson and Dr. Smith, for your presentations. Lots of information for us to process. And one thing that struck me as I was listening to each of you is Dr. Thompson and Dr. Plaza, you have been at Oregon State and in Oregon for 20 plus years.
Sure have.
And I would love to hear from you about the transformation, if any, or at least the changes that you've seen in the time that you've lived here.
Robert, go ahead, man. I'll come on after you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Yeah, I'm not sure what I can say, Erika, other than, yeah, there have been changes, but I think as I look at it under the, and certainly there's a lot more, and certain discussions of, I imagine a number of years ago, you couldn't talk about white supremacy like we're doing now. And I think in that sense, and certain things in Oregon. But I think under neoliberalism and the ways of economic, how would you say, austerity, how it plays on schools, how it plays on colleges, education system. I'm not sure, probably has gotten worse in some ways, but I was just looking at a headline, Portland, this is 2021, February 7. Portland has the 5th worst disparities in the nation in terms of according police stops of African Americans and things like that, or the numbers of African Americans, 2.something% of the total population, I forget right now, where they make up something like 9%, maybe 10, 12% of the incarcerated population in the state of Oregon. So yeah, there's a lot of rain, there's green things here, but as far as and there's the possibility of community, but it's, yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. Maybe Dwayne can chime in and I might remember something there, but yeah, that's a hard one. I'll put it like that. And I think what Dwayne says, I really appreciate the idea of bringing up the idea of generational trauma, PTSD or whatever, that type of thing, because that certainly is something to, if you're raising children, raise children here, we have to think about. So if you have to think about what's going to happen. I remember coming here and with the kids and having to go to school almost every day, every other day, every week to deal with the teachers and the principals in terms of how they were handling, my kids or the boys, especially in that respect. So yeah, that's kind of a I won't say touchy, but it's really personal in a sense.
Right.
Right? Talk about that in maybe a different forum, a setting. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Erika, I came here as a international person in the sense I came out of Canada. So I was actually coming to the United States, somebody with certain preconceptions of what the United States would be like. And so Robert's heard me say this before, and certainly say it a lot, is that when I first got to Oregon State University, within the first week, I was pulled over by the police 5 times in Corvallis. Again, this was a practice that Corvallis police certainly had about trying to figure out who who these people are, who are people of color on our campus. There was very, very few of us in the 97, 98, when Robert and I both both got there. So you were always under a microscope. And so I've seen that a lot less now. I would certainly say that we certainly have a more diverse campus. But what I don't think has changed in a great deal of respect is still some of that unconscious cognitive biases that people actually have. And that is something that people have learned. They've been socialized to have in terms of their lack of ever coming into contact with someone of color. The way that they may have come in contact with someone of color is through the TV media or through indirect knowing of someone. A test I always like to give to anybody who tells me that they have lots of Black friends is I say, okay, let's pull out your smartphone. Let's look through your pictures. Let's see how many pictures of Black folks you have in there that are actually friends of yours and not somebody who you are downloading a picture from. This notion of having collegial relations with people versus having friendships with people has certainly also changed. Again, as we get larger in terms of numbers, critical mass, one of the other things I also see is a revolving door. Some of my colleagues come, they can spend 4 or 5 years, and then it's just too much, and they actually they rotate out. And so it's really hard for people of color to have a foothold. And again, Robert has sort of hit the nail on the head. You have to find a family to bring with you. It's hard to find family members that are here. It's hard to be in a situation where you're a single person who is trying to, make it on your own in Oregon. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it at that because we can keep going with that as we move along with the questions.
Thank you so much for sharing. I can speak for myself that if my children weren't here with me, I don't know if I could have made it this long. So it does help to have family. Mm-hmm. So we do have a question from an OSU student. And that question is, are there ways to integrate or better integrate education of being mindful of colonialism into mid-level STEM classes at OSU? And anybody can take that one.
Okay, you're asking for me? Okay, I'll jump in here. I certainly think it's very possible to understand, for example, in the STEM fields, the exclusion of people of color in terms of their contributions to the STEM fields. And there are many. Unfortunately, when people want to talk about, let's say, the Henrietta Lacks, for example, and her situation and how her body was used as a opportunity for using of HeLa cells that came out of her body. So to me, using information like that to help students really understand that in the STEM fields, it's not a field that actually doesn't have a whole long history to it where the Black body was considered as pathological. And it was also okay to do research on them without ever having them ever, give consent. We know of examples, for example, of the Tuskegee syphilis study. We know examples where Black bodies were used for anatomy schools, where you dig up a Black body and take it to an anatomy school, sell it to them, and they would actually give it to their medical students. We know of situations where, for example, Black women were used in early gynecological research, where they're, I can't remember the name of the physician now, but he was looking at fessulas, and he studied 12 slave women by examining their bodies without giving any anesthetic at all, but developing his techniques. Okay, so that's just about 5 different examples there. But what I'm getting at, it's up to the professor to start being proactive and looking for examples of where you can bring in examples of where people of color have been used in research or they've contributed to research for us to have a great opportunity to go away from this whole notion of white supremacy. Because if you don't do that, as you know, Erika, then the white supremacy narrative creeps in that Black people and people of color have never contributed to science, and all of science was created by white folks. And white folks are the magical set of folks who invent things and do things. Well, there are lots of people of color who have developed and done things.
Yes, and died for a lot of modern medicine to happen. I agree.
Yeah, I was going to just add, if I heard the question correctly, I think one of the things, and I agree with Dwayne on that in terms of what the professor or instructor in the class to kind of bring in things and open it up in a way that's different from the mainstream. But also, we had a class taught a course in ethnic studies on women of color in science. And that's something, if I heard your question right from the student, that's something that could be established. I was with, just a couple of weeks ago, with engineering students. We had a talk with them. They're reading, the group is called Engineers That Read. It was a wonderful conversation with them. And on the area, we're actually looking at Toni Morrison's book, The Origins of Others. And, but there are ways that things could be done, probably special topics, and then going through the curriculum, either in the School of Science, College of Science, or something like that, where you could actually have courses that are taught, about various scientists, biologists who are Black, and so on and so forth, engineers. We just talked before, we mentioned talking about the hidden figures, for instance, and I usually bring that up in my courses, the women, the computers, the African-American women who made it possible for John Glenn to go into space. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't go unless this one Black woman verified the numbers, because he didn't trust the computer. So they've been there, and as Dwayne's right, I mean, white folk aren't the end all, the beginning, and the alpha and the omega at all, and everything in between. So yeah, I think there are ways that could be done. I think students have to ask and kind of petition and go to the right places, and you can open up something there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Another question is, I think most of us that are listening are horrified at the past and even the most recent past of January 6th. Do you have some suggestions of how to move us forward?
I'll just answer, and not trying to be flip or anything, but know your history. You have to know the history. You not only have to know sort of the orthodox history, but it has to be the heterodox. It has to be that history that counters. It's beyond the mainstream. There are Native indigenous histories. If you read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, The Indigenous People's History of the United States, or if you read some other histories by many, many other authors, Nell Painter's as a historian, that's a way of getting at it. But actually being honest, face, if you will, as Jean Theo Harris would say, we have to face the disfiguring mirror of the truth. And as Baldwin would say, yes, unless not everything can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless we actually face it. So we have to face these histories. There's no magic bullet. There's no panacea for this. It took time for it to get to this place, and humans built it and constructed it. As Dwayne talked about the social, historical, political construction of race. And it can be dismantled and will be dismantled by human beings, by the way. It's in my opinion, it's in that process now, looking at how it's been exposed over the last 18 months there, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to offer an opinion? Stacey, go ahead.
So, I mean, I have this kind of conversation with my students a lot, and especially when I teach these subjects in a US history survey, a lot of the reactions that I get from our overwhelmingly white student population are, this history makes me feel uncomfortable, this makes me feel bad, this makes me feel guilty. And what I really sort of try to do with all students, really, but it's just, sort of say, like, guilt is not a useful emotion, right? Because guilt becomes like paralyzing, and it means oftentimes kind of throwing our hands up in the air and like, well, what can we do? The past is just so awful, and where do we move on? And so what I really try to emphasize to my students is that the point of history is we're not trying to say these are basically the point of history is to understand where we are and where we've come from, and it's what we do with the history that really matters. And so what I tell them is, like, I want you to know about this history because it makes you a more informed citizen when you walk into, well, I guess in here in Oregon, we don't walk into a polling place, but when you mail in your ballot, right, that you know this history, that you know that your vote could mean different things given your knowledge about this historical discrimination and set of power differentials. And so I try to sort of instill hope into my students in sort of thinking about, well, how can we use this toward building the United States that we wish was there, right? History always feels, US history feels guilt-inducing, that we're you know, you're supposed to feel bad about that history and so forth. And I mean, and that could be a useful thing, but at the same time, I think it's really important that students think, well, then let's build on this and move forward. And if this was not the country we wish it had been in the past, let's make it that country now. And the only way we can do that, the only way we can live up to, let's say, you know, the phrase all men are created equal, right? These founding principles, is to make it happen in our own time, right? If we don't like the past and we're upset about it, we feel guilty about it, the way that we correct it is to make now the country that we want to see.
Yeah, just a quick point on that, and you got me thinking, Stacey. You know, just a concrete example: the recent movie Judas and the Black Messiah, and I think one of the things that that's very instructive, and I talked to my students about it because I saw the movie a couple of weeks ago. The whole notion within the Black Panther Party in Chicago, Fred Hampton and others there, and the Rainbow Coalition, that wasn't something that was started by Jesse Jackson. He just poached it. But the idea, and was really fascinating because I did some research on this long before the film, and I talked about it a long time in terms of how do people work together? Can people, is race, you know, is it race? I want to say this, that race, I'm gonna say it's not an illusion because as some say, what people believe to be true and real is real and true, and its consequences. One of the Chicago School sociologists talked about that. But so people will work out what they believe to be true in a sense and see real. But it's racism that creates race. So we're looking at it as a verb. But what they did, because how is it possible that Fred Hampton and his comrades were able to form together a coalition of an alliances of the Young Lords, the Puerto Ricans, the one of the big Black gangs there, African-American gangs in Chicago, and a group of people out of the Appalachians, the coal country and Kentucky and Virginia, West Virginia, the Sons of Liberty. And when you read the story, you read on, they had a relationship with the Panthers for about a year. As a matter of fact, Fred Hampton talks about how he'd gone for about a year to their place of where they were meet and have dinner and everything. And then after about a year, those Sons of Liberties wearing their stars and bars, they didn't say you have to take your stars and bars, you can wear your stars and bars. They would come into the city and come to play to the other part of town and be with the Panthers. So there is that kind of the notion that there's unity, that there can only be unity in the sameness. But I think the Panthers and others, the Iroquois did, going way back, but we won't go that far back, in the notion of the Longhouse, which that talks about, the distinct families, but diversity, unity in diversity. You saw that being played out in the late 1960s in the urban center of Chicago with the Black Panther Party. So it has done, it's possible. I think we have to show examples of people here. Here's where it's done. It's being done now. Standing Rock, it was happening in Standing Rock a few years ago and other places around. So it's happening around. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Someone else might want to add to that.
Dwayne, do you have thoughts on how to move
Yeah,
forward?
so I'm going to come back to what I thought I heard you also asking from that speaker or the questioner was the notion of what happened January 6th and can we come back from that? Is that what I also heard you say? Okay.
Yes, horrified by those events of January 6th as well as the past.
Right. So I think there's a perspective that permeates our culture. And the perspective is that white folks are benevolent, they're trustworthy, they're nonviolent, and they are folks who are reasonable. And I say that intentionally because that's ultimately what the Capitol Police expected of that group that was coming to Washington on January the 6th. That's the stereotype that was going through their head. In contrast to that, had that been a Black group that was coming in that direction, the stereotype would have been completely the opposite to everything I just said. Uncivilized, evil, untrustworthy, mob. And let's bring all actions forward to make sure those people don't do anything horrendous. The interesting part of that to me was as the commentators, as I watched it, I was actually home that afternoon. I was teaching, but I was also watching this on the television. The commentators couldn't even believe what was happening because for them, they had also bought into this whitewash notion that all those notions of white folks is everything that was not being played out there. Then as the event was finished, then it became a new narrative that those aren't actually the people that actually went to Washington. That was a fringe group. They're actually a group that actually doesn't even belong to that group. Actually, let's call them Antifa. Let's call them all kinds of things, but let's not label those as white American people. And so I want us to think about that because as we go through our lives, my life in particular, I have to also realize that those people that pull me over when I drive my car, those people that are in Homeland Security when I go through the airports, those people who are the firemen, those people who are the judges, those people who are et cetera, who are often white, I need to realize, and I actually know this, that system that actually exists right now doesn't necessarily work for people that look like me. There's enough of those people around permeating those systems and have created leadership roles in those positions that are actually ones that need to be either rooted out or not be working there anymore because those individuals have created a culture within those places that's very anti-people that look like me. And to think about it any other way is really hard for me to, justify and say, oh, it's only one or two bad apples. It's a system. And the system itself is very much in place that it's circular logic for them, and it becomes cognitive bias and it becomes racism and it becomes all those things that keep people like me, again, at bay. So it was really an interesting phenomenon that took place. And how do we get around that? Well, we have to, as Robert said, I think, start going to the past, and as Stacey probably said the same thing, and realizing that those issues that have taken place in the past, we need to deal with those and come to terms with them in the sense of recognizing them, acknowledging them, and realizing that those systems created opportunities for some and didn't create opportunities for others. And those systems have put certain people in place that they can enjoy privilege now, but their privilege is very much dependent upon the fact that they and also their ancestors actually benefited from a whole linear process that brings them to where they are today.
And just to kind of chime in, if I can kind of riff on Dwayne there a little bit there.
Sure.
I didn't hear that first part and understand it was in context of January 6th. Okay. But I stand by know history because one of the things, and just reflecting on that, is that wasn't an anomalous event. There were coups. As a matter of fact, there's a coup of 1898, the Wilmington, North Carolina coup, where the fusion government was overthrown. Then there were other types of, and that was by the red shirts. This time it was the red hats. It's important to see that you had the Colfax massacre. You had white folk going into in the Reconstruction period in the 1890s, duly elected governments, and just at gunpoint saying leave and be out of town there. So what I saw, and I like what Dwayne said, there is that I got to true glimpse of white privilege there. It was absolutely crystal clear, at least to me. One, as Dwayne rightly said, a couple of months earlier, when there was a Black Lives Matter demonstration, peaceful, there were soldiers and armed up cops all over the place, and they were gassed. That was a third or a fifth of the security there that particular day. The other thing that I found fascinating that really shows in terms of looking at white supremacy and privilege and immunity or impunity that we saw there was the fact that you could hear some of the very, and let's be clear about this, that wasn't just a whole bunch of poor white folk there. There were a lot of well-heeled, middle-class white people there, okay, a part of that, as well as the Oath Keeper soldiers or the cops or whatever. There's a whole bunch, so me to be very clear and not put that on poor white people, because that's not the case. That's really not true. We have to really do a better analysis of that. But one thing, one woman was, she's caught being sprayed, and she turns and says, "No, you're not supposed to do that to me. That's for Black Lives Matters."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and over again and again, you got that there. So this was a really interesting, really very interesting time in looking at, because we tended to play with white supremacy with half a face, with Jim Crow, and never pay attention to Jane Crow, because they work together.
Mm-hmm.
It's all there, and we have to pay attention to that and understand that. So it signals some really ominous types of things here, given, as Anya Presley said in a very nice, I think it was the Washington Post or New York Times op-ed piece, where she said the symbol of this mob going through the Capitol and everything, and then after it, the people cleaning it up were people of color, Black people, cleaning the feces off the walls and cleaning the broken glass up. And then that's been the pattern. That's been the pattern in this country. And it still is. And until we face that squarely and examine ourselves of who we are and what does this mean, as Baldwin said, as long as you're white, I have to be Black. In that sense there, we're in trouble. There's a conundrum. There's a problem here. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And we only have about 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get to 3 very good questions. The first is, Stacey, about your timeline that you shared at the beginning. As a student in K through 12, we were never taught that. What is keeping the topics from tonight being presented to our children, since history is so important?
Yeah, so I didn't go to school here in Oregon. I'm actually from Colorado, and I think that I think curriculum in Oregon schools today probably does not a perfect job and not probably an adequate job, but at least is I think starting to incorporate this material into K through 12 education. Most of my students do come to college at least having a sense of these laws, if not sort of the whole timeline of them. And so I want to, first acknowledge that I think our K through 12 teachers are really working on that. And it's, of course, a work in progress. I think that it's there's a tendency, at least this is my sense, to dismiss these laws sometimes because they didn't actually, very few people were actually expelled. There's only this one documented case. And so I think it's easy sometimes to sort of shrug that off and say this was more symbolic than it was of real importance in the state history. And I obviously what I was trying to do is kind of push back against that and say like, well, no, I mean, yeah, one man may have been excluded, but look at the whole, this is just one part of a whole other or a whole huge anti-Black legislative platform in the 1850s. So it's not just that one man, it's a whole structure that's being both so in some ways made from whole cloth here in Oregon, but in some ways being imported from the Midwest and the upper South slave states. And so, I think that it's important to I think that once we put that in the context, the Lash Law and the exclusion laws in the context of this broader, not just anti-Black agenda, really sort of just anti-people of color agenda, I think it becomes much more palpable just how important that was, that it isn't just this one man, Jacob Vanderpool, that gets expelled, but a really important institutionalization of racism from the very, very earliest roots of the state. And so I think, one thing is, I think the big thing is sort of taking the Black exclusion laws really seriously, even if we look on the ground and say only one person was expelled, not dismissing that law and really thinking about how it fit into this broader set of racial practices in Oregon. So that's one way, is to kind of keep pushing that forward as a really important part of the state's history. I think also, I think that it's also a really tough history, of course, to teach young children, and I think that there's been a lot of new curricular efforts out there. If you are in the K through 12 world or know people who are, there's a really great project out there that probably my fellow panelists are aware of. That's called they've just changed the name of it, but it used to be called Teaching Tolerance. But they've changed it to something I actually think a better name now. But a really good set of curriculum videos for teachers of all different grade levels. And even though it's only supposed to go through K through 12, I actually use a lot of that curriculum in my US survey courses. And it's really like reading The New Jim Crow, right? This book that's come out about mass incarceration, and so taking some of the excerpts from that book and really making them accessible to, if not really young kids, but at least to middle school and high schoolers, and sort of making this literature on social justice for Black people accessible to a K through 12 audience. So there are great teacher resources out there, and I would encourage anybody to check out Teaching Tolerance, and there are some other websites too that really have this as their central focus.
Erika, if I could add to that a little bit, my observation at Oregon State University with colleagues who actually don't actually teach this kind of stuff in their curriculum because they get afraid. And what I've witnessed is that some of my colleagues take something called difference, power, and discrimination training. This is training they can actually do in summertime. They're then encouraged to develop a curriculum and a syllabus for their discipline to then teach a course in their discipline that actually has this theme or motif of looking at power, discrimination, looking at gender, race, all the lenses you can think of. What I notice is that my STEM colleagues go to these trainings, but then they never come out of the training with actually doing anything. And when I ask about them, about what's going on, often they say to me, well, I'm kind of scared to kind of get in front of the classroom, and I've got 100 people there, and I'm worried about the resistance I'm going to get. I know I'm going to get one of those students who's going to, berate me and X, Y, and Z. I think the same kind of thing goes on in the primary and secondary school levels. And that is, teachers are getting this curriculum, like Stacey's saying, but then they get afraid of the backlash from the parents that show up in their classroom that say, hey, what are you teaching my kid? I don't think you should be teaching that. They go then to the next level, go to the principal. And then eventually, of course, you have enough squeaky wheels. The principal then tells you, hey, listen, don't, let's not even do that this term. Let's just kind of wait for this kind of kids to move forward, and you'll try it again next year. And then it never gets done. And that's what I've certainly witnessed, this sort of risk-averse people in Oregon. And the risk-averse people means that they're not willing to stand up and talk the truth because they're so afraid of the possibilities of someone calling them out and them having to defend something. You know, and that always is something that people of color like myself and Robert, for example, we don't have that luxury. You know, that's not a luxury. In other words, if we're teaching this stuff, we have to stand up and be able to roll that ball up the hill every single quarter and watch it come down and go back up. And we have to come up, you know, every time we have to come back in the classroom and do the same thing year after year. Again, my colleagues have the choice. Whether they do it or whether they don't, there's no real consequence to that if they don't do it. And so that to me really starts to reflect what I observe anyway that goes on in my institution around people infusing the notion of difference, power, and discrimination within their curriculum because they can do it. It's just they are so risk averse, they don't want to do it because they'd rather just sort of say, I'm going to focus on content only in my discipline, forget about the rest of it. I only have 10 weeks. It's too much. End of story.
Thank you for that. The next question that we have is, since we talked a lot about land, deeds, exclusion laws, what would reparations look like? Giving examples on a local level for financial as well as socio-emotional pieces. And then a similar question is, what are your views on reparations for descendants of enslaved people?
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Dwayne.
All right. So you can tell I actually have a few opinions. So for me, reparations would mean, in my opinion, would be healthcare systems, education systems, housing systems. In other words, it wouldn't be monetary necessarily to people you can't, you know, but what we've seen as I've painted my picture for you all in my presentation is that these were the situations that African Americans were essentially excluded from, right? The healthcare system, the education system, the housing system, right? So if we can figure out ways of using that as the so-called reparation, and of course employment opportunities, those to me become the reparations that we need to be talking about. That is creating situations where it's not seen as affirmative action, it's seen as this set of folks have had 150 years since slavery has ended, that they have been excluded from these systematically, institutionally, through policy. Therefore, in order for us to start even getting on the same path to some sort of equality, we need to create those. That's my opinion. So others, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Always when people ask, it's like, and I don't think about it that much, but I'm glad you led Dwayne on that. One of the things the first thing that came to mind for me is land. One of the things that Black farmers are having over the years, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, it's been a while since I've read this, but there's been in terms of Black farmers losing their farms because of certain actions, legal actions, or lack of support from the federal government when it should have been there. That could stop and actually give. That's been something, I forget the numbers, but the numbers of the acreage lost to Black farmers is incredible. Actually, for me personal, my own personal background or history from my grandfather, great-grandfather in Arkansas, and Dwayne talked about Homestead. Well, he had gotten under that when I think it was under Garfield to African Americans at that particular time, 162.8. I have the deed in my file here, and quite successful farmer, quite successful. But what Dwayne saw, now my own personal bio there, he was a successful Black and was lynched because of that in Arkansas. Very successful. I mean, I have all of his census, taken up to 1910, the year he was murdered there. All his sons worked on the farm. They all had houses on the farm. All were literate. Piano in the house, on and on and on, you know. And so that for the Thompsons met, and they were scattered. After that, they were scattered to the four winds. Some went back to reservations in Southeast Texas. Some went up into Missouri. So I think about that, and I agree with Dwayne in terms of it's been done. In terms of reparations, the Japanese, the government dragged their feet for a number of decades till there's only a few left, and gave them about $22,000 at what happened in the internment in those concentration camps in the Second World War in February 1942. But also it's interesting because Randall Robinson has written a book entitled The Debt, What America Owes Black People, and goes through very well on that. And there has been a coalition or collaborative work between Japanese community and the Black community there. So talking about people working together across ethnic lines, they've been working on that for quite some time. So it's not something new in terms of reparations. It could be done. There was an effort to give reparations after the bombing of Black Wall Street in 1921 in Oklahoma, Greenwood, Oklahoma. That didn't pass, but there has been that. The late John Conyers, Congressman John Conyers, for many, many years in Congress, representative from Detroit, had gone through and put up every year reparations on that. Whether it's money, people say, well, you can't prove or this or that. I'm not going to get into that thing. I'd say, why not in that respect? But I know how people play with when we get into like the range, the spectrum of what Black is in the country's one drop of Black blood, Indian blood makes one Black, not white in that sense. So I can imagine people coming out of the woodwork to make a claim on that, this is the same thing that happened to indigenous peoples. People all of a sudden, everybody was a Cherokee in that respect. I said, wow, that's interesting. Where are the other groups there? And where are the darker youth folk in that respect? So I think, yeah, there should be something done on that. It's the political will, and it's actually a moral issue. I don't want to, I like the title, Love Your Neighbor. And the deal is what Johnson said in, was it 1962 at Howard University when they gave that speech. And it was a very interesting talk he gave, President Johnson, and talked about affirm action. How is it possible that you can have a fair society when for so many years you've had, he gave an example of a race, and you got someone in those nice light racing shoes with spikes, and they're gone off to 100 and 200 a meter and everything, but you still have someone who's, you're told, you're free now, but your shoes are cement. You can't race, you can't compete in that race the same way, okay? So he said, what we need, and he really extended from that, the executive order that was given by Kennedy before him. And Kennedy said, what we need is a firm action. We need the firm, in that sense. So affirmative action, yeah, is something that people should think about. I wouldn't shy away from it. I don't think we've talked about it. The land hasn't been paid for, labor hasn't been paid for. These things, the books are still open, if you will. There's no statute of limitations on this at all. And I think Americans and people would do well to pay attention to that, really pay attention to that. They're not closed. They're not closed. As the arc of justice, it may be long but it does bend, and we'll work towards bending it to justice at some point, okay?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
The last question is for you, Dr. Thompson. People want to know where they can see or read your plays.
Oh, the play? Yeah, well, that's been a long one. Dwayne knows about that. Way back, Dwayne, well, it's been coming 2017. I started working on that. The summer of 2017, I go to Dwayne's class and ask for actors or folk to come in, and no one. But anyway, but we worked for a couple of years, and it was scheduled to be in the theater here on April 25th of last year, 25 Saturday matinee, and COVID took it. And then we worked through in the fall, that was when we got a director. We actually have a director working with the retired Charlotte Hedrick, who came in after we wrote it. I, did the thing, and she's really done a great job with it. And so right now, this Friday, we are having a job shop at the local Episcopalian church. So we've invited 5 students to come in. And job shop is where someone can come in and critique it and look at the actors. It's going to be kind of a working rehearsal, staging going on, but we want some feedback from students. Then the Majestic, we're looking at being in the queue for the Majestic to have it filmed in in March, actually. Video clip there, because everything there is being videotaped and they'll edit it, and then we'll have it out probably in April. Liz, the theater department has us in the queue for the fall of this year coming. We're probably first up in queue for that. So the actors are ready. They're chomping. Actors like athletes, and they got to compete. They've got to be out there in the audience. They've got to just hear it and everything. So that's where we are. So it should be going, and we have a wonderful actor in Harry Jacobs as Nikki, Braxton Franklin, who's just developed just incredible. And then we got a recent one, because we're looking at race here. She's an octoroon. So we have a woman, her name is Harriet Owens Nixon, who is, and you have to come and see it and see, because it's going to be a wonderful conversation around the concubinage system in the United States. And Harriet Jacobs ends it, her last talk is, the end of the play is, look, we are, here I am in 1850, I can't go anywhere because of the Fugitive Slave Act. And I'm in a city of New York that traffics in women. So that's the part of major part of the theme there of that play. Okay, thanks for asking. Really appreciate it.
Of course. So thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience. And I want to thank you for your presence here with us tonight. And we have a few more days left in Black History Month, but I want to remind you that Black history is American history. So don't think that it just stops on February 28th. Continue to know your history, continue to explore, and continue to learn. And as always, love your neighbor, regardless of the skin that they're in. Thank you so much.